The funeral had just ended. Their 82-year-old father now rested in the cold earth. Incense still lingered on the altar, and tears still streamed down the children's cheeks. Everyone thought the story of his life had closed, a life they believed held no secrets. Only years of hard work, a weathered old home, and the quiet love he poured into his family. But in truth, it was only the beginning. While cleaning out his familiar room, the youngest child stumbled upon a thick envelope tucked away in the wooden cabinet. On the front, in his shaky but unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Open only when I am gone." The family froze. They looked at one another, palms damp with sweat. Outside, the wind creaked through the shutters, and the air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Everyone sensed that inside that envelope lay more than just a few ordinary lines. It was a hidden truth, buried for years, one that could forever change the way they remembered their father. When the envelope was finally opened, a long letter appeared, filled with uneven, trembling words. "My children, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. I cannot leave you much money, but I leave you something far more important." The room fell silent. Not a sound was heard, only muffled sobs and trembling hands passing the letter from one to another. That letter was not simply a farewell. It was a secret, a confession, a spiritual legacy, one that left his children and grandchildren in tears, their hearts gripped with pain. From that moment on, no one in the family could ever see their father the same way again. Before the secret letter was opened to everyone else, he was just an ordinary old man, perhaps even too simple. His life was tied to a small house at the end of a narrow alley, its tiled roof moss-covered, its walls patched and worn. He wore the same faded shirts and threadbare pants, the soles of his rubber sandals nearly gone. His old crooked straw hat, frayed at the edges, he refused to replace, no matter how many times his children begged. "It still works, why waste money?" he would say with a quiet smile. He rarely spoke and almost never expressed his feelings. At family meals, he sat quietly in the corner, always giving the best portion to his children and grandchildren. He never once said directly, "I love you," or "I'm proud of you." Yet his love was written clearly in the smallest acts. He rose before dawn to light the stove so breakfast would be warm. He secretly saved a few coins so his grandchildren would never be turned away when they asked for money to buy notebooks. On stormy nights, he stood at the door waiting for his children to return from work, holding out an old raincoat, eyes fixed on the dark road. Neighbors saw him as a gentle farmer, living quietly. He spent his days bent over the vegetable garden, carefully pulling weeds, watering each row. In spare moments, he tinkered with the broken door hinge, hammered a dented pot back into shape, or patched a worn-out sandal. His whole life he rarely thought of himself, only of how to ease his children's burdens. As the children grew, each went on to their own life and work. When they gathered, their father was still the same, quiet, asking for nothing, never complaining, never demanding. Most thought he had nothing left to pass on except the memory of a frugal, ordinary life. Some even whispered to themselves, "Father was poor. He never saved much for us." But they didn't know that his silence was a shield, covering the sacrifices he bore, the burdens he carried. A life that seemed so plain was filled with more than anyone could imagine. That's why, when the letter was opened, the family was stunned. the quiet, thrifty man they thought they knew, had left behind a priceless inheritance, not of wealth, but of love, sacrifice, and long-kept secrets. The thick envelope trembled in the eldest son's hands. No one dared to open it at once. They looked at each other, eyes filled with curiosity and fear. At last, the youngest daughter carefully tore it open. Inside were several yellowed pages, the handwriting crooked, shaky, yet heartbreakingly familiar. The first page began with, "My children, if you are reading this, it means I am gone." The room grew still. Even the ceiling fan's creak sounded like a heartbeat skipping. The letter continued, "I cannot leave you much money. All my life I lived in poverty, as you know, but I want to leave you something more important. Something I believe will last, even when I am no longer here. I have kept these things hidden for many years because I did not want you to worry. But now, with no chance to speak face to face, I must write them down so you can fully understand my heart." By now, tears were flowing. The second daughter buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The eldest son gripped the table edge, fighting to stay composed. Each trembling line pierced their hearts. "There are things I did that I never told anyone. There are sacrifices I carried with me to the very end, so you would never feel the weight of them. And there is one secret. After you read this, I hope you will understand that my love for you was never less than the words I could not say." The air grew heavy, every heartbeat echoing in the silence. They had always thought of him as just a poor old man with nothing to leave behind. But now the letter was slowly opening a door to a truth that would change everything. The youngest daughter continued reading, her voice breaking. "I don't want you to cry for me. I only want you to understand why I chose to live simply. Because behind that simplicity were things I did for you, things I never spoke of." At that moment, the entire family froze. They knew this was no ordinary farewell note. It was his final confession, a truth he could never have spoken while alive. The youngest son's hands trembled as he turned to the next page. The words slanted unevenly across the paper. "My children, there is something I did many years ago but never spoke of. Today, I want you to know the truth." The room grew utterly silent. "Their father wrote, years ago, when your eldest brother's business failed and debts piled high, I sold the only piece of land I had left to pay it off. I never told anyone, because I feared he would carry that burden of guilt. I was afraid he would live his whole life in shame, when all I ever wanted was for him to hold his head high and start again." The eldest son froze, his trembling hands clutching the table's edge. Sweat broke out across his brow, his eyes red with tears. He had never known his father had shouldered that crushing debt for him. All these years he thought it was luck, or that the creditors had somehow forgiven him. He never imagined that behind it all was his father's silent sacrifice. Their father continued, "From the day I sold that land, your mother and I lived with less. I know you sometimes wondered why our family never seemed to get ahead. But I chose silence. My joy was never in a larger house or a table full of food. It was in seeing my children walk tall, unashamed before the world." At those words, tears fell like rain. The second daughter sobbed uncontrollably. The eldest son collapsed to his knees, covering his face with both hands, crying out, "My God! Father, why didn't you tell me? I blamed you for being poor, for living such a hard life, never knowing you carried my mountain of debt." And then came the line that struck them like a blade. "I never regretted that land. The only thing I ever feared was my child living in disgrace. I would rather suffer hardship myself than see my children bow their heads," the room filled with the sound of weeping. Each heart felt pierced by an invisible knife. They remembered the times they had resented him for his frugality, the complaints about a life of want. Only now did they understand. Every sacrifice, every shortage, had been born of love. Their father never spoke of it because he feared their guilt would be heavier than the debt itself. The youngest looked around at his siblings, then continued reading. The letter was long, and each line seemed to carry its own weight. "My children, I know I leave this world without much wealth. But I did manage to save a little. I did not spend it on myself, and I will not leave it for you. I leave it for my grandchildren." Gasps filled the room. Tear-filled eyes lifted in disbelief. He had written, "I opened a small savings account, not much, but enough to help with schooling. I hope it gives them opportunities so none will have to abandon their dreams because of poverty. As I once did, I want my grandchildren to remember." Their grandfather left no gold or silver, but he left faith that education is the only way to rise above hardship and live with dignity. The youngest daughter's voice broke as she read, tears streaming down her face. The grandchildren sat quietly, sobbing. They had never imagined that the man who wore old clothes and ate the simplest meals had been quietly saving for their future. One line in particular made the whole family weep aloud. "My life was poor, but I do not want my grandchildren to inherit that poverty. If the seeds I planted today grow tomorrow, that will be my greatest joy." The eldest son lowered his head, recalling how often he had criticized his father's penny-pinching ways. Never buying new clothes, never spending. Only now did he realize. Every coin carefully hidden in that wooden box, every small denial was meant for the children's children, for the future of the family. In that grieving room, for the first time, their sorrow turned into gratitude. They realized the man they thought poor was, in truth, richer than anyone. They had inherited a wealth of love, sacrifice, and generosity of spirit. The youngest son drew a deep breath as he turned to the next page. The writing wavered, ink smudged as though the writer had cried while holding the pen. "My children, I have lived a life of silence. But there is one thing I carried to my last breath with regret. Today, I must confess." Every eye turned to the letter. The room seemed to freeze. He wrote, "When I was young, I made a mistake. Because of my stubbornness and lack of wisdom, I lost a great opportunity for our family. That chance could have given you a better life, but I let it slip away. Since then, I chose a life of simplicity, trying to make up for it in every way I could. I know I was never perfect, sometimes clumsy, sometimes failing. But believe me, I loved you with all I had." The second daughter broke down, recalling the times she had accused him of being too old-fashioned, too poor, holding the family back from getting ahead. Only now did she see. He had been the one most haunted by that loss, though he never admitted it. The letter continued with the words that shattered what remained of their composure. "I never once said I love you. But every meal I cooked, every time I waited for you to come home late, every coin I saved for the grandchildren, that was my way of saying it. My words were clumsy, so I let my actions speak." The eldest son fell to his knees, tears pouring down. He remembered the mornings of his childhood when his father walked him to school in worn-out sandals, waiting at the gate before quietly turning back home. He had never once heard his father say anything sweet, but now every memory came flooding back, each one a belated "I love you." The whole room dissolved into sobs, not just for loss, but for regret, for all the times they had mistaken his silence for coldness. Only now, reading his trembling words, did they understand. Their father's love had never been lacking. He simply never knew how to say it. When the final lines of the letter were read aloud, the room sank into silence. Only the sound of muffled sobs remained. From the altar, the father's portrait seemed to look down at them, his gentle eyes whispering, "I am still here. You simply never listened." The eldest son collapsed to the floor, his sobs breaking through the heavy air. For years, he had blamed his father for their poverty, for not giving him a secure career. Now he felt a regret so sharp it tore at his soul. Every complaint he had made, every harsh word, his father had already borne it silently, so that he wouldn't have to. The second daughter clutched the letter, her tears staining its fragile pages. She remembered the meager meals, the arguments when she stormed off in anger, thinking, "Father refuses to change." Only now did she see the truth. Her father was never uncaring. He had simply chosen silence because sometimes silence is the only way to keep peace within a family. Even the youngest grandchildren wept. They thought of their grandfather, the one who slipped them candy, who told them bedtime stories, whose bent back still carried them to school. Only now did they understand. Even the coins he pressed into their hands came from a lifetime of sacrifice they had never seen. Through tears, one child cried out, "Father, why didn't you tell us just once? Why did you keep it all inside, only for us to find out now when it's too late?" What they held was not just a letter. It was a mirror forcing each of them to face how blind they had been to his quiet love. And that realization made every tear fall heavier soaked with regret. That night, no one in the family slept. They sat together, passing the letter from hand to hand, reading its trembling lines again and again. In that moment, they finally understood. Their father's love was never in the words he failed to say, but in the sacrifices he had made until his very last breath. The letter ended, but its weight lingered, not just within that home, but in the hearts of anyone who hears the story. Because it is not only the story of one father, it is the story of millions of parents who chose silence as their language of love. Mothers and fathers do not always say, "I love you." They may not know how to express it as openly as the young. But every meal cooked, every bead of sweat, every coin saved, these are their words of love. The tragedy is that many children realize it only when their parents are gone. When calling out father or mother is only an echo in memory. When regret comes too late to heal. This letter teaches us one thing. Do not wait until it is too late to listen. Do not wait until you are reading their final words to understand how deeply they loved you. Ask, listen, cherish them now, while you still can. A dinner at the same table. A sincere thank you. A hand held, an embrace, a whispered "I love you." They may seem small, but they are the living letters your parents long to hear, before they no longer eager. As one geriatric doctor once said, the elderly do not fear sickness, nor even death. What they fear most is being forgotten. And the letter from this 82-year-old father is proof of that truth. After the funeral, the family sat together, reading the letter over and over. Every trembling line was not just advice, but the final gift their father left behind, a gift of love, sacrifice, and words too heavy to speak in life. Perhaps this story is also a reminder for us all. For in countless homes, there are fathers and mothers living quietly, hiding their burdens, but never ceasing to love their children. What parents want most is not the money their children bring, nor the expensive gifts they give. What they need is often something simpler. A family meal, a kind question, an attentive glance. To them, these are treasures beyond price. Dear friends, ask yourself this. If your parents were to leave you a letter like this today, what would you hope it would say? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, your words may be the reminder another child needs to cherish their parents before it is too late. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Golden 60 Plus. Here, we don't just talk about senior health, we tell stories of family, connection, and timeless lessons that make life warmer. May every family be filled with love, so that while our parents are still here, we will never need a final letter to understand their hearts.